You're listening to Inside the Notes. I'm your host, Erica Block. Here we have the opportunity to listen to the stories that connect our musical family tree. First-hand accounts of performances, musicians, and mentors that shape the way we listen, learn, and teach. On today's episode, we are chatting with Clive Greensmith, cello and chamber music professor at the Colburn School and a 14-year member of the Tokyo String Quartet. Welcome.
Thank you, Erica.
Clive is joining us in Bellingham for a very special event. He has championed the rebirth of Paul Hermann's cello concerto. Tomorrow with the Whatcom Symphony, he will be performing the North American premiere of this concerto, which was realized by the Italian composer Fabio Conti. Could you tell us about your adventure, how you found this concerto, and kind of how it's grown underneath?
Of course, I'd be happy to. Well, it all began with... We have several programs at the school that involved a number of people. In one case, it was an old friend of mine, Simon Weinberg, who is the director of an organization called ARC, which is an ensemble in residence at the Glenn Gould Conservatory in Toronto. Mm-hmm. And I'd known him for a long time. And he is at the forefront of research being done to hunt down composers who had been oppressed and whose music had been neglected. Mm-hmm. So we call it recovered voices. Mm-hmm. And moreover, at the school, we have something called the Ziering Conlon Initiative, which is the conductor, James Conlon, who's the principal conductor of the LA Opera. Mm-hmm. And in partnership with a wonderful philanthropist named Marilyn Ziering, they fund a program at the school. Anybody can sign up for classes that happen in the spring semester, and it's been going now for the last 6 years, and it's an ongoing project. And so if you were in LA, you could sign up, and every week on a Monday, I think it was, you would get to hear guest speakers, and Bob Elias, who's a wonderful historian, would share different examples of this, of various composers of the period which was usually from between the wars and mm-hmm. during the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And so I was alerted to an appearance of some new scores. It was almost as a sort of a side note, because we were trying to put together our annual April concert for Bob Elias, and that meant recruiting students to play pieces that were often not composers they were familiar with. Mm-hmm. Me too, actually, in some cases. They were the famous recovered voice composers, such as Gideon Klein, the Terezin composers, Schulhoff, Zemlinsky is another one. Of course, Schoenberg is a recovered voices composer. Right. Ernst Krenek is another, who ended up in Palm Springs.
Right.
If you look at the map of LA, there were so many European emigre composers.
Wow.
Hans Eisler is another, and I played some of their music when I was in the Tokyo Quartet. So we were organizing the concert, and Bob told me that he'd been in touch with Simon Weinberg, and he'd been given these scores by a couple that had very generously donated some money to the Colburn Community School, and it was an award to honor somebody in her family, Susan and Murray Brown, who has Hungarian Jewish roots. She's a speech therapist, and Murray, her husband, they're both wonderful people. Murray is, I think, a psychiatrist. And so they gave some money for a young cellist, and they called it the Paul Hermann Scholarship Fund. And so I knew that there were these scores, and they said, and you might be really interested to see that there's an assortment of chamber music, there are some songs, and there's a fragment, there's one movement of a cello concerto that has never been played. And so I was given this, delivery. I took delivery of these scores, and I have to admit that for a month or two, they just sat in the corner of my office. But of course, Colburn is a very busy sort of environment, and exactly. So I finally got around to looking at them, and so I press ganged as many students as I could into playing all of these different works. There was the string trio. I think there were two duos. One is called the Grand Duo that Paul Hermann wrote for himself to perform with his colleague, famous Hungarian violinist Zoltán Szekely. And there are photos of them playing together, and of course they popularized the Kodály duo They came from, Paul Herman was born in Budapest in 1902, so his background includes names such as Leo Weiner and Zoltán Kodály.
Wow.
Anyway, so the scores, I took a look and I distributed parts, and it's hard because students are so busy. I mean, we have these short semesters, and so there's limited time. But we managed to pull off. I managed to get people in seats for all these different pieces, and there were these wonderful songs. And then Simon Weinberg called me and he said, "You're going to love the songs. They're absolutely riveting. It's fantastic poetry, the French symbolist poets, and his music is just so touching and really quite special." Mm-hmm. And so I could see that. I mean, I remember sitting down at the piano and playing some of the chords and thinking that it was just very beautiful and unusual. And then I gave the cello concerto to one of my students. I thought it would be correct to just let all the students take care of the performance.
Right.
But he was also, this particular student, I at that point was co-directing the chamber music with my colleague Martin Beaver, and I only had a half-size studio, so I had 6 students, I think.
Right.
So they were all involved in different things. And so finally it got to about 10 days before the concert, and I was checking in on my student Ben, who's a wonderful cellist, really quite a special player. Well, they all are in their own ways, but I somehow felt he might really enjoy the piece. But he was really too busy. He had so many things he had to do. He was an undergrad. He was doing his bachelor's course. So I thought, well, who's going to play the concerto? And I looked at all the different cellists, and I thought, well, maybe I should lead from the front, and I should practice what I preach. Instead of just delegating, I'll play it myself. And I didn't really think anything much would come of it beyond that one concert.
Right.
But as I got into the piece, I remember looking at the part on its own, thinking, well, there are some passages that maybe if he'd lived longer he might have cut a little bit, or maybe he would have put this in a different register. But that was just me being impatient. I'm too hasty a judgment. But when I sat down and we read it with the piano, a wonderful pianist called Beth Nam, who I'd worked with before, we had a reading session of the piece, and suddenly I heard all of these beautiful sort of bewitching harmonies, and I could sense that this was a 23-year-old composer that really had something very special to offer. Music of that period, there's so many different kinds of styles, and with the breakdown of tonality in the early years of the 20th century, there was so many interesting directions that music went in, and you look at these big centers like Berlin and Budapest and Paris, and that's where Paul Herman was in all of those different centers. He was all over as a composer and as a performer. So we pulled off this concert, and I think we had, I don't know if it was 4 world premieres, but certainly the cello concerto was a world premiere, and I think one of the other works might have been, and everybody was very excited. It was one of the most meaningful musical experiences of my life, I must say. And so I talked with Bob Elias, and then came into my life Paul Herman's grandson, who's going to be here tomorrow. And his name is Paul van Gastel. And Paul is by trade a physicist, and his mother, who is the only the child that Paul Herman had, who was a little baby when Paul died. His mother is now retired, but she was a prominent Green Party politician in the Netherlands.
Wow.
Because her mother, who died in Germany before the war, was from a Dutch family.
Wow.
And they had, I think, maybe 4 sisters. And anyway, so Paul married this a Dutch lady, and so there's a Dutch side of the family.
Right, like so much Europe, just Europe in general.
Yeah, and of course that was very interesting because I have family in Holland too.
So many connections.
Yes, and I have friends in Italy where Paul lives. He lives in northern Italy, and so I'll elaborate on that later. But so he came, and obviously was the man more than anybody else that was driving this effort to bring his grandfather's music to the attention of the world, and he had been, I think, solely responsible for, with guidance from Bob Elias, for putting parts onto the internet, onto the website IMSLP, so we could print them out. He was very free with that. There was no copyright issue, and that meant we had access to parts.
Right.
He did. He was very free in sharing family stories, photographs, and then the tragic part, which was always very difficult to sort of. It's hard not to dwell on it.
Right.
But the tragedy of his life cut short. Anyway, so Paul came and he listened, and he was just the most enthusiastic and zealous cheerleader you could imagine for his grandfather, who he never met.
Right.
And was determined that we were going to make more of the piece, because I was so touched. He was so happy with the way the piece came off, the cello concerto. And so we became very good friends. And then every time he came to LA to visit his family, Susan and Murray, we would get together. And so at one point we thought we would have the songs would be part of the other movements, because I was so impressed by them, and he was too. But in the end, it was Paul's idea, alongside Fabio Conti, the musicologist composer in Italy, that we would plunder other works of Paul Herman to give us a kind of a blueprint for more movements. So we ended up with a total of 5 movements. So that's the story.
It's amazing. And you ended up with a whole new set of friends and family.
I know. I call it the sort of Paul Herman clan.
Yeah.
And there are other relatives who came all the way from Europe. Clara, who is, I think, Paul's cousin. She came, and she's a former violinist herself who used to play in the Concertgebouw. Wow. And she knows, again, they all had stories of this. And then, of course, Murray and Susan here. I think it was Susan's father. I have to get all these facts right, but she had a very strong connection with that. And so I found myself as a member of this sort of group of people that we were all trying to tell the story of Paul Herman in different ways,
right?
All focusing on his music, and then it sort of grew and grew, and we had an very interesting symposium. The Recovered Voices Initiative has used to have an annual or biannual conference symposium, and James Conlon came and spoke, and I met people like Michael Beckerman, who's a huge scholar with Czech music of that period, and my students got really interested in the whole thing. And so I played it again, and then I gave a little speech, and Bob Elias was very sweet. He was the one that came up with the title for my speech, which was Paul Herman Cello Concerto, Conversations Between One Cellist and Another. And I wrote a speech and a presentation, played the piece, and then spoke about it. And then we made with Paul's help, we made the first CD, which was the first. It was a mixture of Paul Herman pieces, some piano works, chamber music, songs. And that's now out on the Etc. label, and so you can hear the one standalone movement of the concerto, which is the original movement, with cello and piano. And so, of course, after that, we didn't know what was left. So I called up Simon Weinberg, and I said, we really, before this all took off, I said, I hope there's an orchestral score of the cello concerto. And as if sort of by magic, it appeared. And I remember Paul wrote to me these gushing emails saying, "You'll never guess what happened. I was back in Holland with my mother, and she produced the following score." And there it was in his own hand.
Wow.
The full first movement of the cello concerto, the first movement, with all the orchestration. Then you could see there's the harp and all the woodwind writing, and you could then see the lines that you'd heard in the piano. They translated into all the different colours, the timbres of the different instruments in the orchestra, and you could see he really understood the orchestra very well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a almost an exoticism at times with the harp.
Yep.
The wind writing is beautiful, and you just, the whole thing is in sort of colour now.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
it's an incredible kind of dive into history, and also at that time, so many of these young composers it was challenging times, and they had a very mature way of looking at the world, even in these young ages.
Yes, and there's nothing like the performer composer. I have such regard for this kind of super musician that is able to play as well as they compose.
Right.
And so in this instance, you can feel that there's a cellist behind the notes.
Right. He knows you can do it.
He does, and it's hard.
Yeah, exactly.
You can tell that he played the Kodály solo sonata. You can tell that he knew the French style very well.
Right.
And you can tell, my favorite part is you can tell that he understood the lyrical capabilities of the cello and the way that it can transmit tenderness and soulfulness, and that comes out so strongly in the piece.
And the acrobatic moments are a little bit understated sometimes.
Yes.
You can see that you're working, but it still is a beautiful, soulful line.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is fun, it's not just a showpiece.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And then I have to say, when Fabio came in, he did a wonderful job of figuring out orchestration for the music that was taken from the Grand Duo.
Right.
And he made it work beautifully.
How did he get involved in that?
Paul knew him. Paul is a singer, and is still
the
very
ultimate connector.
Yes, Paul is the motivation for so much of this, and he would fly across from Europe several times, all out of his own pocket.
Wow.
And it was just really impressive and moving the way he wanted to make this happen for his grandfather. It's really
it's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful, and it's so fun that the Fabio Conti is here as well.
Yes.
So I feel like we have a little bit of a group of all of these people who've put all this effort in.
Yes.
And it's an incredible piece. The wind writing is beautiful, and he's always moving the line around.
That's right.
And it's definitely a team effort.
Yes.
That's beautiful. Very exciting. Well, I would love to kind of step back and hear how the cello found you. What was your earliest days? Were you from a musical family, or did you bump into this?
Well, yes, I am from a musical family, although my parents, they didn't earn a living from music, but they both trained to be performing musicians. So my mum was a double major in voice and piano, and she went to the Royal Academy of Music in London. And my father read music at St John's College, Cambridge, and he was a very multi-talented musician. He conducted, he played the organ, he played the piano, he was a brilliant academic musician, and he was a great organizer. They both had choirs for their whole... I mean, my dad, until the day he died, was conducting an amateur, semi-professional choir, as was my mother. And they both ended up in firstly as classroom music teachers. Then my father became head of music, and then he became a headmaster. And so they both, when we had kids' birthday parties, they would play the piano. So when we had Pass the Parcel or musical chairs, it was always with somebody playing the piano, either one of my parents. So, of course, it was sort of preordained that we would... I have a twin brother and a younger sister. So my earliest musical memory is of two works. The first, it's quite an incongruous mix. The first work I remember was Carl Orff's Carmina Burana when I was about a year and a half. And the other work was HMS Pinafore by Gilbert and Sullivan.
Perfect.
And so,
very contrasting.
So there we were in East London, and my mother was adamant we would both play the piano, so my grandfather had made a bench for them to play piano four hands, which doubled as the kind of teaching furniture for my mother in the middle and me on the left and my brother on the right. And the piano, was something we had to do, and it went along okay. My brother was much more amiable and easily taught than I was. I was rambunctious and impatient. Yeah. And so my parents decided after a while, my mother said, she was determined that she wouldn't be able to work with me ever again. I think I'd lasted about 4 years. And then, it was all very upsetting. And I remember then coming home from school one day, and there was a cello in a case, a music stand, and a book. And apparently they'd chosen the cello for me because my mother loved the instrument, and they had probably 40 LPs, which many people had in those days.
Yeah.
And I apparently, it's funny how you forget these things at different stages, but I had a routine apparently, which was to go downstairs in the morning and lie on the floor and put my head next to the speaker, and I always chose a cello piece. And it was usually this picture. There was a picture because the albums were so evocative, you know.
Absolutely.
They were big, and you had to. It was a ritual to take the LP and take it out of the sleeve and put it on the turntable,
and then big picture.
That's right, and you'd stare at it. And there was this elderly bald guy like me with glasses, sort of eyes closed, and it was Pablo Casals, and it was the Dvorak Concerto with the Czech Philharmonic, recorded in 1938 with George Szell. And I just loved the piece, and apparently they noticed that this was my little thing.
Cool.
So they picked the cello for me. And the other reason they chose the cello was that there was being knowledgeable and probably quite pushy. They'd heard that the best teacher of any instrument in the area was a cello teacher called Martin Bochmann, a German emigre who'd ended up in the beautiful Oxfordshire countryside, which is where we were then living. We'd moved to a little town in the Cotswolds called Chipping Norton. And so I went for lessons, and I remember the first lesson. He looked at my hand and said, well, pinky is a little bit short, but it's a good cello hand. In the beginning, we must spread the butter thinly, he said. With young children, we must go slowly. So I was subjected then to this very regimented, Teutonic, Germanic approach to the craft of cello playing. It was, bit by bit, it was very structured. And my father was there every week for the lesson, and then drove me back home and practiced with me, and then played the piano for me, or my mother would do that. And so after about 3 years, we moved again. I had a sort of basis. I was 11 at that point, and the cello, it was rocky for a few years after that, but probably by the time I was about 12, that's what I felt like I should be doing in life, and that was I guess it was my thing. It was what made me feel like I was somebody, and the cello always felt good, and then I started to play concerts, just little things,
right? And
I noticed that playing a concert was very meaningful, and the attention of the listener, and the connection with the listener and the performer, and the sort of sacred part of all of that. I liked that, and then alongside that, I sort of fell in love with a piece that it was a record. It was a recording. It was the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony, which it was one of those sort of Damascus experiences where I listened to it one day and thought, I couldn't believe the ending of the first movement. There's a celeste with the chromatic scale, and the cellos play the theme, the first theme, very softly. And I remember being gripped by how dramatic this piece was, and how colourful and how soulful, and I just fell in love with it. And that was the catalyst for my exploration into pretty much early 20th century repertoire. Right. So I was about 13, and that was all I was interested in. Anything by Stravinsky, anything by Bartók.
That's awesome. It's a very refined palette for 13.
It was weird. I don't know where it came from. And well, actually, I can tell you because my father had a lot of scores. And I remember the first time I followed through with him a BBC prom. In those very cultivated days, they were televised.
Right.
And I remember following through The Rite of Spring with him. And we didn't get lost. And we got to the end. And I was just taken aback by this music. Yeah, so I just sort of found it fascinating. Then later on, in England we have this really good O and A level music, and I discovered the German Romantic period, and Schumann, Schubert, Lieder, and that became a fascination. And then I was able to get into the pre-college of the Royal Northern College, and that gave me a good training in keyboard harmony and
just more of an understanding of it all.
Yeah.
What was the recording of Shostakovich 5? Do you remember what it was?
That was also the Czech Philharmonic with Karel Ančel, who I don't know too much about him, but he was super important for that period. And I remember the cover. It was this enormous flower. It was sort of pink-orange flower on the front. And it was colorful and it sort of drew you in.
Right.
I just loved it.
Graphic designers of the time were geniuses, how they
some of them
kind of cultivated that for us, because everybody remembers the covers.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think hearing that's one of the biggest threads that has spun through each musician thus far is if you were lucky enough to get the teacher at the beginning that gave you the real foundation. Those people always shoot to the top because it's that foundation that is so hard to pull apart and rebuild later when they're 18, 19, 20.
I wouldn't be here. We wouldn't be having this conversation now if it hadn't have been for that man. And my parents too, especially my dad, because he was so hands-on. It was like a little project for him.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I remember he wrote me a letter after I left him. I'd been only with him for 3 years, and we went on holiday to Germany. And I wrote him a postcard, and I said, Mr. Bachman, I'm in Germany, where I know you're from originally, and hello, and how are you? Hope your summer's going well. And he wrote me a letter back, and I still have it. And in it, he says, I think, he said, first thing he said was, I was upset to see that your letter to me was not already written in German.
Perfect.
And then he ended it by saying, I think there's something I should be telling you now, and it should be very meaningful, but I can't think of anything to tell you. But I do have one thing. He said, never guess when you play anything. You should always know why you're doing something. And I thought, wow, that's something that I could, I should ask myself that all the time when I'm playing or when I'm teaching or doing anything in life. But,
right.
It's amazing to go back and see that and read it.
And be like, yes, thank you. And I remember, and I try to do that. Yeah, I think if you can, it's harder and harder, especially because music is less in the schools and their kids are starting later, and a lot of the general public doesn't really understand kind of the art of learning an instrument in the same way that they used to. Maybe everybody had to take piano in the 60s, and now they don't. But if you can get a teacher who gives them that foundation at the beginning,
so
the passion clicks in automatically, and you can easily create a monster and have these kids kind of just go for it.
Yeah, for sure.
Whereas it's just so hard when you get to college and you have to make an enormous physical change.
I know. It's like an uphill battle if you haven't had that.
Right.
And a lot of it is luck. I mean,
and it's such a blessing to have a musical family or somebody who understands what's going on, and then you kind of, if you love it, then you can have it.
Yes.
That's a great segue to, I was reading about some of the competitions that you did. It sounds like you already had a deep love and you were already really invested in all aspects of music, but doing competitions, it's such a level of stress and like solitary work, and then you go out and perform. Did you ever come to the wall of the performance anxiety? And did you have kind of a way of working through the nerves of those moments where you have to do it now, like an audition setting?
Oh, I've had lifelong struggles with nerves. I remember my first concerts. I say concerts because the first concert went very well. I think I was about 9.5 or 10. I played a small piece, and I remember feeling really happy and thinking that it was easy being on stage. And then I played the next day. I was given the chance to play in a big concert venue because apparently I'd played well. And so the next day I was in a much bigger environment, a much bigger space, and I remember my hands getting very clammy and sweating and thinking I was going to drop the bow, and my body felt completely different. I kept having to go to the toilet before I played, and it was suddenly, it's not easy and it's really stressful. And every time I had to play after that for years, I would get nervous days before, and I would somehow get through it. And then, I have to say, it was always, and it is continuing to be very difficult. And and I guess I've asked myself why, and it's because, of course I want to play as well as I can for the composer. I don't want to be seen to fail. I've asked myself all these questions in an attempt to sort of rid myself of nerves. Yeah. But I'm just resigned to the fact that I'm built that way, and I'm kind of highly strung, and I'm always going to be a little bit uncomfortable. And so when I teach, I don't want to impose or the kind of challenges that I'm dealing with. I don't want to invent them problems that don't exist for my students. But I've seen that most people, they have some kind of anxiety that manifests itself in different ways. And I think one of the reasons why I can teach now in a sensitive way is that I know what it's like to have problems and really big problems. Like you don't have the fluency or the confidence on stage that you wish you have had or could have, and it's an ongoing challenge.
Is there, especially in those moments like an audition or something like that where there's really no room for a problem, you have to just go and execute, can you get yourself to, is it more the focus of just being completely, like get yourself into the moment?
I think if the level of preparation, I've learned this over the years, I used to think if I played and there was an imperfection, it was just bad luck.
Right.
But now, when I'm older and more experienced, I realize I can trace back to sloppy preparation or not enough preparation or not enough, for example, mock auditions.
Right.
Because when I was in the quartet, we did multiple repeat performances, and by the first, after the first 3 or 4 performances were out of the way, I began to see the problems ahead on stage, and then I knew what to practice, what went wrong under pressure. So I'm also very practical about that. I know that if I play the Paul Hermann Concerto a half dozen times, then passages that were problematic, I'll know how to approach them and how to improve and refine them. And that's the same with the students. And I see them, they all say the same thing. Oh, it's so hard, I didn't expect it to be that difficult.
Exactly.
And I say, well, that's what you're going to practice for next time.
Exactly.
And just being on stage, constantly being on stage with people watching your every move with hot, bright stage lights, or an acoustic that changed, or your jacket is feeling tight, you don't remember to practice with your tux on or whatever, and just knowing that your muscle tension is going to be different, your heart's going to beat that much faster. Just to take that all into account when you prepare.
Yes, absolutely, and it just is endless preparation, and I feel like if you've got 4 concerts, the first one goes well because you're so nervous and excited. The second one feels scary. The third one you're getting tired, and the fourth one's great because you're like, I'm almost done.
Yeah, right.
So there's that journey with the repetition as well. Yes. So how did your opportunity to join the Torchio Quartet become?
Well, that was again, I've had a lot of very good fortune. And so the funny part that probably people don't know about this is that when I went to Italy, to Cremona, to compete in a competition called the Premio Stradivari in 1991, it was a rather large jury. And one of the jury members was at that point still the founding member cellist of the Torchio Quartet, Sadao Harada. And I remember him, the way he sat and listened to me, and he was very supportive of me. And we had some conversations after the competition was over, and then I went to hear the quartet. He was the only person in the quartet that I actually had any personal connection with. And of course, he was the outgoing member. So what had happened was I'd gone to the Marlborough Music Festival in 1994, and I went for 3 summers, and then I was in England still living there, and I was finally I got a job in an orchestra principal of the Royal Philharmonic, which I didn't expect to get, and I was then I guess people were looking at me as a kind of orchestral player. Then I won a job in San Francisco. It sounds like I was here, there, and everywhere. It's your 20s, you do anything to get a job, and you're trying out different things.
Right.
And then I was given this job in San Francisco, and somebody came to me in December of my first year there. This is 20 years ago in 1998. And he said, hey, the Torchio Quartet, they're looking for a new cellist. Are you interested? Shall I recommend you? And my reply was, I can't leave San Francisco. I've just arrived here at the conservatory. They'll hate me forever if I leave now. Even if, by some miracle, I were to audition for the Torchio Quartet and they would hire me. They don't know me. They're not going to hire me. So I let the whole matter just die. And then I was in London about 3 months later, and it sounds like something out of a Graham Greene novel, but I was staying with a conductor friend, John Wilson, and it was my last concert with the Royal Phil, because I'd been going back occasionally to do concerts because I loved the principal conductor, Daniel Legatti, and the orchestra had asked me if I would go back occasionally just to lead the cello. So I was doing a concert at the Barbican and staying with John. The phone rang and John picked it up and he said, "Clive, there's a Misha Koppelman on the phone asking to speak to you." He said he's from the Toka Quartet. So Misha called me. He was in London. And he said, "Clive, we'd like to meet you. Would you be interested in having dinner with me?" I said, "Sure." I had an evening free, and it was a typical kind of grey, drizzly London evening. We met near the Wigmore Hall, and we went and had dinner, and we chatted. And then he called me the next day, and I think there were no emails at that point. It was too early, 1998-9. He rang and said, and at that point my wife Chizuko got a call from the second violinist's wife, Kikwe, who was also Japanese, and my wife's Japanese. So they had a conversation, and then it was determined that I should come in 2 weeks' time. I would have gone back to San Francisco and then gone to New York. And I was broke. I had no money at that point. We had a house in London. We were renting had a 2-year-old child. My wife wasn't working. I was on a visa that didn't allow me to do anything outside of the school.
All right.
Anyway,
perfect storm.
Yeah, so I was typically very lazy about getting my flights. So I had a flight that went from London, touched down in Philadelphia with US Airways, and then back to San Francisco. I did a no-show. They called me and said, "We need you next week instead of the week after." I said, "Oh, okay, great." So I did a no-show for that flight, bought a single ticket for a week later.
Oh my gosh.
4 days later. I took a train to Stanford, got my cello cleaned, adjusted by the makers. They were modern makers, Peter and Wendy Moos, and I stayed with them. And then I went to the home of Misha in Westchester, north of Manhattan, and I read with them there on the Saturday. And they sent me a list of pieces. They wanted to do Death and the Maiden, Schubert, a Mozart, a Beethoven, and then they made me read one of the big cello movements from one of the Prussian quartets by Mozart, the B-flat K589, and then we did also read K575, things with big cello parts.
Right.
I remember nothing terribly daunting. I mean, nothing like Schoenberg's Second Quartet or Bartók that I didn't know at that point. I was 29, I think.
Wow.
Maybe, what was I? Maybe more. Anyway, so I read with them, and then the last, the day that I was, the second day of reading, I got a call from Kikwe, the second violinist, and he called me and he said, "We'd like you to be the new cellist." And I said, but why me? And he said, "Well, because with you we have a future." And I said, "I feel so honored."
That's amazing.
So I thanked him, and then I went back to San Francisco and had the daunting task of explaining to the dean and the president that I'd be leaving. But they were very sweet, and a wonderful guy came in, Jean-Michel Fontaneau, who took over my job in San Francisco, and then I moved east.
Wow, right away.
Yeah, and then that lasted 14 years.
So it was a wise choice. And of course, they understand if you say you just got into the Tokyo Quartet.
They were immensely supportive. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So is the folklore around quartet life real? Did you guys really rehearse like 8 hours a day? What was the experience like?
We did in the beginning. I remember there were very intense rehearsals and discussions, and there were moments when the quartet was just so busy there wasn't time for anything else. Latterly, we'd learned a large amount of repertoire, and the repertoire was becoming more familiar. They'd been in existence for 28 years, so I joined and I had some repertoire, but not much.
Not 28 years worth.
I know. So complete Beethoven, complete Bartók,
wow.
All of the 19th century rep, Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Beethoven, Takemitsu, all the piano quintets, the sextets, the string quintets. There was so much rep to learn, but we got through it, and sometimes rehearsals just seemed to go on forever and ever. But the quartet was very efficient, actually. Mm-hmm. I learned that it was possible to work intelligently and get through things in an efficient way.
Right.
Yeah.
Is it generally that there's a specific position that as the leader, or was it, since there were two members who were founding members still then, right? And then you and a...
Well, in the beginning, my strategy was just to listen and to not say very much,
right,
because I felt like I had to kind of absorb myself in the sort of fabric of the group, which was good in a way because it meant that I was able to figure out and change my playing to fit what I felt the group needed. But then after a while I realized that I was blending a little too much. I needed to be a little bit more assertive.
right,
And so I kind of grew into the job, and I would say it took about 3 years to feel like I was able to sort of provide the sort of anchor and the tonal support and rhythmic support that the group really needed. And it went on developing like that. I think when you join a quartet, you have to learn, yes, you really have to learn the role of the quartet
right,
cello. The cellist has to provide a certain kind of focus and a foundational layer tonally, and has to think very much about the vertical, and also has to be very generous in terms of rhythm. There are times when any of your three colleagues need flexibility, and there are other times when you need to put your foot down and make sure that things are right. And I was probably a little too guilty of being bending and flexing a little bit in the beginning. I used to get feedback that, oh, he's great, but he's a little bit too smooth, or he's so accommodating. And but it's just normal. You grow more confident.
Absolutely.
And you need a lot of concerts to feel confident. You learn that, and it doesn't happen overnight. It happens slowly. And I think if people tell you it's going to happen quickly, they're mistaken, because anything in life I've found that is of worth or of value, it doesn't happen overnight. I mean, you can have a revelation or an epiphany, but the hard daily work is where it's happening, and then you'll look back after a number of years and think, we've come to a new level, and then there's all the new problems to
right, exactly.
conquer.
There's always something waiting for you.
Yeah.
Was it interesting melding? Two of the members were Japanese.
Yes.
Where was the fourth member?
Well, the first violinist when I joined was Misha Koppelman, who'd been in the Borodin Quartet for 25 or so years as the first violinist, and he moved to the Tokyos 3 years before I joined.
Okay.
So his background was very interesting. His teacher was, he's actually from what used to be part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a town in the Ukraine now called Uzhgorod. So he was raised speaking Hungarian and then Russian, studied in Moscow with Yankelevich, was a wonderful top prize-winning soloist who was then invited to take over from Dubinsky in the Borodin Quartet in their heyday.
A lot of their recordings.
Yes, right. So Misha then joined the Tokyo Quartet, and so his style was very flavorful, and it had a very strong sort of imprint of this kind of very rhapsodic style, very colorful, and it was marvelous. And the middle voices, Kazu and Kikwe, they were both trained at the Toho School, which is where all four founding members had come from. And they'd been trained by a very important man, Mr. Saito, who you might have heard. Saito Keenan, yeah. So that means Keenan is memory, and Saito is the figurehead of modern classical music in Japan. He was a cellist and a conductor.
Seiji Ozawa.
That's right, at Protégé and some others. So they were all products of the Toho School and were pioneers. And so their training, I guess you could say, came from Saito, which was from Germany, from the German school, because he'd studied in Leipzig, I think. And so there was a strong influence there. But also they'd worked with Peter Ungen then for 14 years. And Peter's musical style is quite different. There's no mystery to me that he's gone on to have an illustrious conducting career, because his outlook is very innately very musical and flexible, very stylish, full of nuance, adaptable. He would change his style from one period to another, and a very charismatic and warm-hearted. Not that Misha wasn't either, but
Right.
So there were influences from Peter. Peter was, of course, a lot of his early schooling took place in the UK. He went to a famous school in the UK, and then I think he studied at the Royal College, and then studied at the Juilliard School with Pellman and Zuckerman, I think. So there were, and of course, Kazu and Kikwe also studied in America. They both studied with Dorothy DeLay and Galamian and Meadowmount. So, but having said that, I don't think you can say the Tokyo Quartet has the Juilliard Quartet, I mustn't forget, they started with the lineup of the Juilliards in the early 60s, and that they often tell me when they won the Munich competition the training they'd received from Raphael Hillier, the violist of the Juilliards, and Robert Mann.
He was a coach of mine at school,
right.
Too.
So that, I think if you could say anything about the Tokyos in terms of their passion and their style, I'd say a huge amount, and that's what they tell me, came from Bobby Mann and from Mr. Hillier. Cool. And that this was so important to them. And then when I met Bobby Mann and I read with him and got to know him, I could see that. That's where it comes from. But in terms of their music making, they had their own voice.
Right. That's such an interesting melting pot
of
schools and
teachings. It really is, yeah. I think fundamentally they were very honest when it came to the score. Maybe when you're young and you're trained in a certain way, you're not able to be objective. You're trained to do things in a certain way. But when it came to rehearsals, we'd argue about something. It was always very. It came from a sort of an earnestness to try and find the best solution or the most faithful.
Serving the music.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Fascinating. My favorite question, which I love to ask every person, you touched on it a little bit at the beginning, is this magic, the electricity, the thing that kind of drew you to loving to play. Do you have a memory of both a performance that you witnessed, that you were not in, where it just captivated you? And then you've played so many concerts, but a concert that might stick out in your mind as particularly eventful for you, where the energy was high, the audience was engaged, the group was engaged, and everyone was kind of playing at their peak moment.
A very good question. Well, I remember going to concerts with my parents because they always wanted us to come, subscription concerts to the Halle Orchestra in Manchester or prom concerts. And I remember, let me think, a lot of choral music. Probably my birthday present one year was to go and hear Paul Tortelier play the Dvorak Concerto at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. And I remember the excitement, because I had all his recordings, as he walked out on stage, and he looked tremendous. He was this tall, thin, kind of Pied Piper-looking figure with lots of very wavy white hair, this wonderful kind of Roman nose, piercing eyes, and he had this unbelievable charisma. And I remember that concert, the excitement of the first 4-minute tutti as I waited for the first note and being completely overwhelmed by that.
Cool.
I remember that very clearly. That was maybe from the teen years, that was the most powerful. I also remember youth orchestra concerts. I remember my father and I got the time wrong of the first rehearsal, and we walked into the sound of Wagner Tannhäuser Overture, and I remember being absolutely astonished. It was the first time I'd heard that piece in the flesh, and I remember loving that. Goosebump moments. There were so many that came later. It's amazing how a recording can come off and touch you in such a deep way. It's a recording, but yet you feel like you're there. Right. You put your head next to the speaker. You're right next to the performers. I used to get very inspired by all of the LPs at home. But you asked me about concerts that I've been part of.
Yeah, something that you played where it was just so special.
Oh, I remember Tchaikovsky Pathétique with Daniele Gatti with the Royal Philharmonic. I remember playing that piece with him on tour. I remember Mahler 5, Mahler 4, when the orchestra was playing at its highest level. couldn't believe it. It was just so exciting, and having a charismatic conductor like that right in front of me, that was really that was as good as it gets. In the quartet, I remember, of all the places, we ended up once in Estonia.
Wow.
Yeah, and we were playing in Tallinn. Is that right? I don't know. I'm trying to remember, because we played in the Baltics. There was a narrow time frame when they had the chance to invite more foreign artists, and I remember one evening playing in a former sort of Soviet Kino type hall, which had been sort of refashioned into a concert hall. I remember playing one of the first performances we'd played of Beethoven Opus 132, and we were in the middle of the Lydian Mode movement, and I remember it was a sort of it was one of those concerts where you can't believe your luck that you're on stage playing this, and being very moved by that, and very overcome. I remember it was just hard to keep the tears back that night. The other concert I remember is in our last season, playing in Madrid, the Auditorio Nacional. They invited us back for a special concert because we'd played there more than in any other capital in Europe. And there were years when we played more in Europe than we did in America. And I remember the program was Beethoven 131, Intermission, Schubert G Major, two of the sort of most monumental pieces for a quartet to play, and both in the same evening. It's one thing to have the G major Schubert, but to precede it with Opus 131 Beethoven, that was amazing. But you've just reminded me now, the one that stands out for me, it's not really about me, it's about our violist. We played a concert at the Wigmore Hall in December of 2012, which was our final season, 12-13. And we still had about 85 concerts to go at that point. And we were in London just briefly, and the program was Bartók's Fourth Quartet, Haydn, Intermission, Bartók Sixth Quartet. And it was one of those concerts where the audience, the venue, the way we played, and the music all kind of came together. The Wigmore is a very special place. It's got perfect acoustic for a quartet, a small ensemble. It looks very inspiring. There's dome above the stage. It's a hall has borne witness to so many amazing concerts.
Absolutely.
And we were on good form, I remember that night. And our violist was probably at that point 62, 3. I don't know if I have my maths right here, but Bartók, when he passed away in New York after the war, was not that much older, or maybe he was around the same age. But the Sixth Quartet is a kind of farewell to Europe, to Hungary, and it has a very prominent viola part. And I remember we got to the end, and it was like one of those moments where you couldn't believe the power of the music. It kind of had this sort of, there was this atmosphere in the hall, and he plays this Mesto theme, which he begins the piece with it, and it was his swan song, and it was Bartók's swan song, and his timbre of sound on the viola at that point in his life seemed so correct. It was a man who spent 43 years in the quartet who was saying goodbye to that life. And he played it with such kind of...
a true understanding.
Yes. And that was a lesson in how long it takes to discover that. And
exactly.
Yeah, you often hear that solo played well, but not with that kind of pathos, but not sentimental. But he had that kind of nobility of expression.
Right.
And we were both in tears after the concert, and I remember it was, it was the viola cello thing in the quartet is very special.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and he and I were very close, so yeah, that's beautiful. Really special.
Yeah, and amazing that he got to have that opportunity.
Yeah.
kinds of, you get those moments where everything clicks in together.
Yeah.
So I'm dying to hear about your cellos, but hearing you say we had 85 concerts left, how on earth do you keep yourself from getting really hurt playing that many concerts and zipping on airplanes and hotels and the mania of quartet life? How do you guys do that?
Well, I guess I'm fortunate in that I got hurt in my 20s and I didn't play for 2 years, so I knew the pitfalls in terms of my own physique and what to watch out for. And in the quartet, the cello line itself, I have to say the first violinist has to be very careful. If you don't rotate, for example, like the Emerson Quartet and some younger groups do, if you don't rotate violins, it's an enormous amount of music for a violinist to carry.
For sure.
But I think, firstly, leave time to practice. Don't rehearse as a quartet needlessly. I think you really have to understand the ergonomics of your instrument. You have to be mindful of. I mean, I did my back in a couple of times, stupidly. I remember in Florence, in a tiny hotel room, literally just taking a shower and then the soap fell on the floor and I leaned out to pick it up and suddenly something clicks in my back and I can barely walk and I had to go to a chiropractor to get my neck cracked and to be and I could barely take my suitcase. And the suitcase was so huge. It was a month on the road or something.
Oh my
Jet lag is hard. We fly to Europe and once I think we played the evening we arrived from America. We were totally jet lagged. Going to Japan or Asia was always difficult because of the days it took to get over jet lag. But I think if you're smart about not overplaying and trying not to push the sound, I mean, you're not playing in 2,000-seat halls. You're playing generally speaking, you're playing in true chamber music halls, smaller venues. There's no need to push the sound. There's no need to shout and scream. And we had beautiful instruments which really helped. We had lovely Strats and that was a great gift. Although my cello was not the easiest cello to get along with, it had its foibles. But it's you're not playing every night with a very loud pianist and you're not playing with a 100-piece orchestra. So
you can kind of sit back into the sound.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So you had the Strad, and that was gifted or loaned to you by the
Nippon Music Foundation. Yeah, and that collection of instruments had been owned formerly by the Corcoran Art Gallery. Oh. They were they were known as the Paganini Quartet, not because they were. I mean, they were all owned by Paganini. They were not intended to be. They were never a match set by Stradivari. They just happened to belong to Paganini, and they were very different in age. 1680. From the second violin to 1720 something for the first violin.
Wow.
From opposite ends of his life, very different in style and appearance. The cello and the viola were closer in style and appearance and timbre. They matched well, but I've seen matched instruments by Amati and Stradivari from the same period, and it's a totally different kettle of fish.
Interesting.
So we actually had to work very hard to get the sound to match. I don't think we need to match all the time. There are many moments when you want to be different.
Right.
But the quartet prides itself on a kind of homogeneity of sound and of purpose musically. And that was hard to achieve sometimes with these instruments. They were very different, especially the violins. So, 14 years with that beautiful cello was kind of hard to give that back.
I bet you might have taken some getting used to, but then you're used to it.
It taught me a lot about quality of sound, and that cello you couldn't force the cello. It needed to be coaxed, and you had to draw the sound rather than press.
Yeah.
And for better or worse, my playing evolved in a way that suited that cello.
Right.
It hadn't been popular with my predecessor as plural, because I know it had been used in various quartets, and you can trace its path back to the 40s when it was first used in the group that named themselves the Paganini Quartet. In fact, one of the cellists who was in that group passed away after a concert one night.
Whoa.
which I only found out a little while ago.
After you'd returned the cello.
Yeah. Anyway, so yeah, the cello, I had to say goodbye to it. I left it in London with my colleagues. We all deposited the instruments there in July of 2013. Then we all came back and played on our own instruments for the final Tokyo Quartet concert, which was at the Norfolk Chamber Music Festival, which is the Yale summer school. And I used the cello I'm using now, the Saucony cello, which I bought several years ago, which is also a Cremonese-inspired Strad pattern instrument, which I like very much.
And where did you find it? Did somebody own it?
Yes, it was owned by a lovely man who lives in Georgia.
Wow.
And he played the cello in school and loves music, but told me that he was so modest, he said he didn't feel he had the right to own it because he couldn't play it. So I wasn't even looking, but he was willing to sell it to me, and it hadn't been played on for a long time. And so I didn't think I really was going to buy it until I saw it.
You're
and tried it. And I thought, this is I lost no time. I remortgaged the house again and bought it from him. And I've pretty much used it ever since, although I do have a lovely modern Italian cello, which I adore, by a maker in Brescia called Filippo Fassa, which I commissioned and he made for me, and I picked it up last year. It's a beautiful cello. It's gorgeous. So I sort of go between the two instruments, but right now I'm playing the Saucony cello, which I love.
And while it had those years of rest, does it take a while for the sound to kind of come back, or is there any harm in them not being played?
I think they really need to be played in their infancy. You can read people going all the way back to the early 20th century, 19th century, who the Hill family used to say, a good instrument needs 5 years to break in. I do believe that the more it's played, the better it sounds, and that a brand new cello, it really needs the vibration that comes when you play it to for the instrument to find its voice. My cello must have been played a lot at some point, because when I tried it already sounded great. Now maybe that's because it's just well made, but it did get better. And I think you have a sound that you imagine. You'll hopefully, if you want that sound, it's your vision of what you want and how you want to sound is strong enough. You'll find a way to make that sound. Your ear is your guide, and you have this perfect sound in your head, in your ear. You'll find a way to make it. Right.
And half of it is being present, to be listening and aiming for something.
Yes.
And not just playing it.
Right, yeah. I think that starts with having a vision of how you want the music to sound, what kind of sound you want. And then as you get older, you figure out ways to make that happen physically. But the why is always more important than the how for me. Yeah.
And keeping your eye focused on the prize.
Yeah.
So for my last question, we could talk all day, I feel like. There's so much I'd love to know, but since being at Colburn is so exciting because really for the U.S., it's the newest school. Yes. It's, mirrored to be similar to Curtis in that you're honing the country's best and brightest and free tuition. Yeah. And it's in LA, which is all of a sudden exploded as this hotbed of classical music. And there's so much excitement to that. What was the time from having Tokyo end and kind of getting brought back to California since your San Francisco was so short?
I was so over the moon. I was so delighted when the CEO and president of the school, Sel Kardan, came to hear the Tokyo Quartet at a showcase concert put on by our management, Opus 3 in New York. I think it was over a year before we finished, and he'd heard that we were thinking of retiring. And at that point, Martin Beaver and I were possibly thinking about continuing the quartet and looking for new members. Ultimately, that didn't happen, but Sel came and invited us to come and give some classes at school. Before we knew it, we'd both been offered co-directorship of the chamber music program, and the dean at that point, Richard Bean, was very much behind the idea, and he and Sel Kardan spoke to us and said, "Why don't the two of you come out and take this job?" the minute they said that, I was like, where do I sign? Because I love teaching. I love working for an institution like the Colburn School. It's a place where you feel you can contribute, first and foremost. It's a place where I have fantastic colleagues. I was able to come in and learn from my senior cello colleague, Ron Leonard. I was able to watch him and observe him teach. He was the main teacher, and I had ultimately a half-size studio, which now I'm the main teacher there, which is an incredible honor to now be the sort of the new Ron Leonard, which is, I'm trying hard to not screw it up and be a worthy successor, but I can't think of anything I don't like about the school. They do so much for the students. There are so many, I mean, this whole, I'm here talking to you now because of something that really was facilitated by the Conlon Ziering Initiative, the Recovered Voices program at the school. There's one example of that. The orchestra, the chamber music, the solo coaching, the studio, the relationship between master teachers like Bob Lipsett and his violin studio, Martin Beaver, Paul Coletti, Peter Lloyd. You know, there's a very small faculty. Fabio Bedini, who's a wonderful pedagogue and a fantastic pianist. All of these people, Yehuda Gilad is one of the great sought-after clarinet teachers.
The ultimate for us.
And Sel Cardan is a man with an incredible vision who's seeing far into the future for the school. There's just nothing I don't love about the school. The facilities are great, the location. And the students are so gifted and so motivated. It's a school that was set up with a very clear philosophy, which is that the performance element takes precedence. It's a performance school first and foremost. You will learn keyboard harmony and history and theory, but these are students that are going to make it as performers. And I think that there's pressure for the teacher because they're very gifted. And it's a young school, so it's a school that's trying to make its mark.
Right.
I'm sure that was the same for Curtis when it was in its infancy, and Juilliard. And it's on the West Coast, so it's hard sometimes. You're not in the sort of
the epicenter with everything right there.
So in a way, it's trying to make a very strong case, and I think succeeding in saying that you don't have to be on the East Coast to absorb the best culture that the United States has to offer. Not at all. I think it's, you can see, as you said, the city of LA is making a very strong name for itself in terms of orchestras, the opera, the LA Phil, we call it the Cultural Corridor, which is the Dorothy Chandler Music Center with the opera, and then you have Disney Hall, and then you have the Colburn School, and then you have the Broad Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art. We now have a new piece of land. We're going to expand the campus right opposite Disney Hall. Frank Gehry is going to help design the new 1,000-seat concert hall. All of that is happening within a very small area, right in the heart of downtown, which is also undergoing a huge renaissance. So it's really exciting to be a school that's sort of at the vanguard of that kind of change.
Absolutely. And getting those students who are just absolutely on fire and really into it.
It's great. And I love being a full-time teacher. It's hard sometimes. I have 22 students now. It's hard. You go away for a few days and you have to double up on lessons. But I love young people. I love our kind of laboratory. They know I'm here playing Paul Herman, and they know how they can get their hands on the music. They can study it, and they can. I can then go back and show them what worked in my performance, what didn't, what to watch out for, what's inspiring about his life story. I feel like those two tracks, me as a player and as a teacher, they're so closely intertwined that it makes the whole idea of teaching and playing at the same time very rewarding. And the students come from all over the world, and I have so many wonderful colleagues that send me great students from Chicago, from Hans Jensen, from former students in Korea, from Europe. It's just really exciting.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
It's a tremendous job satisfaction.
So for all of those cellists out in the world that don't get to study with you, do you have a golden nugget that you can bestow on children and young adults who are going out into the world to try and make it as a musician? Something to keep in mind, like the letter that you received, something you feel like is an important thing to remember as a performer?
I always say that, I've said this often, and I've told my students that nobody's path is going to be exactly the same. We all have different strengths. By the time you graduate, it's hopefully becoming clear what it is that you're doing that's working, what your strengths are, what you play well, what you still need to work at, what you can bring to the table. Always practice the things that are your weak points, but also understand that if solo playing isn't for you, then of course you should still maintain a very high level, but be strategic. Maybe the best advice is be the best player you can and be ready for anything. In my life, I was terribly surprised in my 20s that I did certain things that I didn't think I would end up doing. But I was entrepreneurial and I tried to go for it. I did competitions, took auditions, and by the time I was 30-something, I was in the Tokyo Quartet via a principal job in London. Some people told me never to do orchestra when I was younger. An agent said, "Don't get lost in an orchestra, Clive." That's where I ended up.
Right.
I ended up there.
And that was a key ingredient.
It was, and it made me as a musician, I think. But it certainly brought something out of me and refined my playing and got me inspired in a way that I would never have expected. Then I ended up in a quartet and I had to sort of reinvent myself, and now I'm reinventing myself again.
Right.
And all the while you've got to be attentive, open, flexible, and prepared to take a risk sometimes. If you get that piece of good fortune,
right,
my advice is be ready for it. If I hadn't have been ready for the quartet, if I'd botched that audition, or if I hadn't had a passion for chamber music, maybe it wouldn't have worked out. But I went in there and I was hungry for the job.
Right.
And I remember calling my wife up and I said, I don't dare hope about this because I think I would really rather like this job. But I think the love of music and the love of wanting to make music with people, if you're passionate and generous as a colleague, people will want to play with you. And they don't want to play with you if you're difficult. And just the respect for music and the respect for your instrument, to make sure that you're always prizing it and thankful for it and observant and open about how you can get better. Pal Herman, it looked really quite difficult and I wasn't sure I could make the concert. I didn't play perfectly, but 3 years later I'm still playing it and I'm still trying to make it sound better. Don't ignore Pal Herman. If Pal Herman comes into your life, a few sheets of music, grab it and go and run with it, and just stay up late or get up early and put the hours in. And even if something doesn't look right at the beginning, if you work hard, you'll figure out a way to make it work. And always remember you're doing it as a service for the community, and you're doing it as an advocate for the composer, and you're telling the story of the piece, and tell it in a way that's going to make it irresistible for the listener, and be sincere about it. I don't like the music business, and I don't like social media and the way I use it, but it's not about that. It's about whether your performance is true and authentic and sincere, and whether the music is truly guiding you, and being open to all of that and saying it with passion. We may not be here tomorrow. I remember thinking about Pal Herman, thinking if my life were cut short. My father died young, and I think it's there at the back of my mind. He died 3 years for me to go till I reached his age, and he died very suddenly. I have to admit, now that's a very strong driving force for me in packing as much as I can into the time that I have left. And I wasn't like that when I was young. I was much more nonchalant. So,
use the time well.
Very much so, and keep pushing yourself, and never never think that it's over. There's always more to learn.
Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. I'm very grateful. Thanks for listening to Inside the Notes. I'm your host, Erica Block. Be sure to check the Inside the Notes Facebook page for details on our next guest.